Hello, insiders. Welcome to today's talk on the once and future Penn Station. I'm Michelle Young, the founder of Untapped New York. I'm pleased to introduce Justin Rivers, our Chief Experience Officer. I'd like to also take a moment here and tell everyone the story of how Justin and I met, because it is very apropos to this talk. We met inside Penn Station. At the time, Justin was working on a play about the demolition of Penn Station, which became the Eternal Space. And he reached out to Untapped New York on Twitter. And for those of you that do know me, a message that comes to my attention and says, "Hi, I'm running a play about the demolition of Penn Station," will always get my attention. So we helped Justin with the Kickstarter for his play and suggested that maybe he could create a tour about the remnants of Penn Station that we still run today. Well, not today, but we have been running it since then. And we literally keep finding more remnants of the original Penn Station every time we do this tour and every time we walk around. So then last year, Justin joined the staff of Untapped New York full-time as our Chief Experience Officer, where he's in charge of developing new experiences, training new guides, and all that fun stuff. But on the side, he also runs the education nonprofit Character Connection that he founded and is a longtime educator in New York City. He literally wears many hats. So Justin, please join us.
Oh, I am here. You can hear me, right, Michelle?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sometimes I don't always trust the mute unmute option, but good. I'm glad that I am here. Really happy to be here again with all of you guys, all the ones who have been attending some of the talks. I appreciate it. Untapped New York appreciates it. For all of you new to the experience, I hope you enjoy it. This is literally my most favorite thing to talk about. So for me, this is going to be great. And actually, this was taken from a talk. I did a series of 2 talks for the National Art Club. One was in 2018, and then one was last year, around this time, early April. This is the Once and Future Penn, which talks about past, present, and future of Penn Station. The first one I did was more about the remnants and the tour itself. So for those of you, anybody on this talk who have been on the Remnants Penn Station tour with me, thank you for joining me. This will be different from that tour. We're going to get a little bit more context behind the whole station. There's going to be stuff that you're going to recognize. For those of you who don't know anything, you're going to become Penn experts by the end of this talk, I promise. The reason why I call it the Once and Future Penn, some of you Arthurian legends and myth fans may know the T.H. White book, The Once and Future King. Well, Penn Station is kind of Arthurian in scope with this epic story. So I've broken the talk down into the 4 different books that the Once and Future King goes through, all hopefully with humorous titles that go along with the book. So let's just start. The first thing, let's do that. There we go. So this is one of my favorite photos of the old Penn Station. It's a 1941 aerial view. I had purchased this photo from the personal collection of Ron Zeal. Ron, who was a photographer, who painstakingly photo documented the demolition of Penn. And actually Penn, not even the demolition, but Penn during the 30s, 40s, 50s, into the 60s and 70s. This is a really gorgeous aerial view. And you can see one of the things that Penn has is a lot of light. And actually this is a problem during the war because they have to black out those windows, but we'll talk about that in a minute. You'll see this was a rendering sent out by the governor's office when they were talking about completing the Moynihan project and doing a larger Empire Gateway project, which we'll also talk about. And I just want to go back and forth here. You see the distinctions, but also the similarities. I'm pretty sure Cuomo's office did this to harken back to that photo because there's such an impressive footprint that both the old Penn had and what they're hoping to be replicated for Moynihan when it comes about. Now, this is what Governor Cuomo has said when he released his initial plans to complete Moynihan. 50 years after the loss of the original Penn Station structure, passengers will once again experience a world-class rail hub worthy of New York. With better access to trains and subways and state-of-the-art infrastructure, The Moynihan Train Hall seamlessly joins history, architecture, design, and function. So last March, Paul Kaplan came out with the newest book on Penn, New York's original Penn Station, The Rise and Fall of a Tragic American Landmark. And so I had sat down with Paul. Paul picked my brain about a couple of things as he was writing the book. We had lunch. I gave him some quotes, totally forgot. And I was flipping through the book when I got a copy of it. And I found this quote. I think it's a fitting tribute to Senator Moynihan, who lobbied so hard for the redevelopment of Penn Station. I think it's a wonderful historical quote to use McKim-Mead and White building to offer a more appropriate national gateway into New York City. I worry that the design will look dated, and I also worry about the idea that it'll just become another subterranean mall surrounding train tracks, but I'm optimistic that the sheer size of it will impress. The pressing question I have is, what happens to Penn Station across the street? It needs to be redeveloped, reinvigorated Penn, not only for the LIRR and the NJ2, the New Jersey Transit riders, but also for the tens of thousands of MTA commuters who pass through Penn on a daily basis. And I read it, it was a big pullout quote. And I said, yeah, that's really smart. I wonder who said that. Yeah, it was me. I had no idea. I had to look deeper into saying it. And that's how I introduced myself. Meet your presenter. That is a picture of me doing one of the earlier Penn tours. Actually, this was for the MAS Janes Walks back in 2017, I believe. It almost looks like something out of a Tarantino movie a little bit. We're all in a line and sunglasses, but a little less cinematic. What started all this, as Michelle mentioned, was actually this picture, the picture that launched 13,938 words, which is the word count of the play, The Eternal Space. So that picture that used to hang in the Amtrak concourse right by the restrooms, actually, by the 8th Avenue exit, got my attention as I was a 19-year-old Fordham University freshman. And I looked at that picture, I was lost. I'd never been in Penn before. Although I grew up in New Jersey, we had our own lovely gateway into the city we used, which was Port Authority. Absolutely beautiful spot, I say sarcastically. But I saw that, I was lost, and I looked at that photo. It was 11:30 at night, and I looked at that exact photograph, and I said, oh my God, that's gorgeous. It must be Europe. I wish that was here. I wish, I wasn't where I was. And then, of course, I hone in on that little label at the bottom, and it says New York, Pennsylvania Station, 1910. And it's 11:30 on a Saturday night. I'm looking for a friend coming in from Trenton, and I look at that, and I audibly shout out bullshit at the top of my lungs really loudly. And of course, people looked at me, so you're a little crazy when you're the one they're looking at in Penn Station. But it launched an obsession of mine that turned into a 10-year research project, which then turned into another 5-year initiative to launch the play, The Eternal Space. And that itself is scene one of The Eternal Space. What we were lucky enough to do with the production, it ran on Theater Row for about 6 weeks. We were creating, as I like to call it, a Star Trek The Next Generation holodeck on the stage, where we used over 5,000 splices of photographs from actual demolition photography to recreate 7 different rooms over 3 years of the Penn's demolition. And that is actually scene one, the 2-man show. That's a black and white of a later scene completely on the concourse. And the pictures actually don't do it justice. It was an amazing, amazing set, which as the writer and then later the producer, it completely exceeded my expectations. The creative team on this project was off the charts. They did a really good job. So then it turned, as Michelle mentioned, into me giving tours. We started out giving tours, once every month or so. Then we started doing more tours. And Michelle, I believe our initial goal was if we got 90 people to attend the Kickstarter tour, we would have said, this was a success. If we could get 3 tours to 30 people going through Penn Station, we would have, they've basically done the impossible. I think we're cresting thousands now who come on the tour. So they've been a success. Now, let's start. So the first book in the Once and Future King is The Sword and the Stone, obviously. And so I've started with the station in stone, and this is actually a construction shot of the station from 31st Street and 7th Avenue as they are building the architectural marvel we'll talk about very briefly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Old Penn in this talk. There's a lot of other resources and other talks we could do just on the old station. But So that's Charles McKim, and Charles McKim was basically the head of McKim, Mead and White. And for those of you who know anything about Beaux Arts architecture, especially the City Beautiful movement, or a lot of the buildings that New York treasured from the early 20th century, McKim, Mead and White were behind it. Um, Charles McKim would not live to survive, or would not survive the construction of Penn. They say the stress contributed to his death. He did not live to see it open. And he had a big problem. He was working with Alexander Cassatt, who was the president of the railroad, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and they could not get their ridership into Manhattan. They had to deposit their ridership here at what is called Exchange Place in Jersey City, which was a gigantic train and ferry terminal combination. And what you would do is your train would pull into this train shed in Jersey City, which is now gone. It was demolished the same time that the old Penn Station was in the early 60s. And then you would board a ferry. And the ferries would take you to one of 3 depots on the west side of Manhattan. This was the 30s-ish Pennsylvania Railroad depot on the shore of the Hudson. And this is an image of the Cortlandt Street ferry terminal for the Pennsylvania Railroad, which is roughly where the World Trade Center would be today. And so if you wanted to get back and forth from New Jersey, this is how you had to do it. And again, I think the stats were something like 40% of the Pennsylvania Railroad riders wanted to get to New York. And imagine being Cassatt and not being able to get your riders into Manhattan directly. Whereas your biggest competitor, which was the New York Central at the time, he was able to bring his people right into 42nd Street at the time, which was a depot transitioning into a station. It was not yet a terminal. So this is Samuel Ray. Samuel Ray was the vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad and sort of the mastermind engineer behind the big project that would become Pennsylvania Station. What Cassatt did was he got in league with McKim, Mead and White. He went to Europe. They toured around Europe. They went to Paris and they saw the d'Orsay, which is now the Musée d'Orsay, which was a train station for many years in Paris. They go to Berlin. They see the Brandenburg Gates. And they go to Rome and they see the Roman Baths of Caracalla, and they love all of this, and they get an inspiration for their new grand station. And they figure out, they first went to the city and said, hey, let's build train tracks over bridges over the Hudson. And the city says, nope, absolutely not, can't do it. Too much ferry traffic, it's never going to happen. Also, you don't own the proprietary rights to bring people over the Hudson. A little railroad known as the Long Island Railroad did, which is why Long Island Railroad gets in partnership with the Pennsylvania. Well, as a matter of fact, Pennsylvania buys them out because they could afford to. But the LIRR keeps their leadership. And they decide to build a tunnel straight from New Jersey, under Manhattan, under Bedrock, and all the way out through to Queens, so that you could connect Long Island on the east side, connect New Jersey on the west side. And that was an engineering feat at the time. So there's McKim, Mead and White. You could tell this is a really extremely posed shot right there. So Stanford White is the guy all the way on the right side with the big mustache. We'll talk about him in a little bit, but Stanford White is sort of a legend, not only because they made a movie about him and of course his legendary affair with Evelyn Nesbit, but also he was definitely an accomplished architect with weird predilections. But what happened was they go in and they buy something called the Tenderloin District of the West Side. They clear it out. They buy, it was considered at the time to be sort of a slum. Bars, halls of prostitution, gambling, all that kind of stuff. They buy it at bargain basement prices. They clear the area out, which could be a talk all on itself. And then what they start doing is, this view is from the Hudson looking east to 7th Avenue. That concrete slab wall in the fore is going to be the 7th Avenue facade of Penn. Those tunnels under that slab are going to be the approach into Penn for trains. You'll also see Macy's sort of popping up at the top over there. And here is a sepia colored postcard of what was one of the greatest engineering feats of the whole project, the North River tunnels under the Hudson. And yes, you're looking at them, and yes, there's 2, and they are traveling under bedrock, under the Hudson River. And yes, they are the same tunnels we use today, which is scary for a lot of people because they are very old and in need of repair. When Pennsylvania Station was done, it was one of the largest train stations in the world. and that was the 7th Avenue facade, which you're seeing in the front. It was the largest colonnade in this hemisphere. That pit of sand in the bottom left-hand corner is going to become Hotel Pennsylvania. For those of you who know the area, that will also be a McKim Mead White project. Um, Absolutely massive structure. So you could fit 3 Grand Central Terminal buildings on the site of the original Pennsylvania station. Now, Grand Central Terminal's basement is quite large, which makes it square footage wise larger, but the building itself, you could fit 3 of them. And of course, there is taken on opening day. I always say on the tour has that new station smell. That is the Roman Baths of Caracalla main waiting room. That roof is 168 feet in the air. Again, to give you a little bit of scale, if you go to Grand Central Terminal and look up at the beautiful mural in the main atrium, that's about 120 feet in the air. So this building dwarfed humanity in so many ways. It was considered by McKim Mead White to be a temple of transportation. They wanted you to feel like you were in something more sacred when you came into this building. There's another view of it. Gorgeous, sumptuous light coming in from all directions, which is, I always say, sadly ironic because there's no light anywhere in Penn today. And that bled into this highly functional glass roof, sort of beehive concourse at the back of the station, which is where you boarded the trains. To give you a little bit of perspective, that is where the Amtrak concourse is today, and Madison Square Garden is sitting on top of it currently. You'll notice the floor, it's harder to see in this photograph, but the flooring is concrete with glass block. And that was deliberately designed so that McKim Mead White could get light from the ceiling, down the floor, down to the lower levels below. They were obsessed with the diffusion of natural light in their station. So Samuel Way, the president at the time, had this quote to say. I'm not going to read the whole thing because if I read all the quotes, we'll be here for a very long time. But this was a letter to the Municipal Art Society, actually. And what he wanted to do was build a neighborhood within a neighborhood. Because he realized they had spent so much money on buying this neighborhood up, he wanted to make sure all of the buildings in and around the station were architectural sort of sisters and brothers to the station. And so that is a postcard of the Hotel Pennsylvania, which is still there today, is getting very slowly a much needed restoration and renovation. But that building is intact. As a matter of fact, most of the buildings from the era that Ray put in and around the station are there. The only one that's missing is the station. That is the Samuel Ray statue done by Adolf Weinmann, who was the German sculptor of choice for McKim Mead White, that used to sit right outside of the entrance to the Vornado offices right before you hit Madison Square Garden on that plaza on 7th Avenue. Since construction has started on Penn, they have removed it, and it is in storage, hopefully to be returned. But Samuel Ray is holding plans to the station and also standing next to a model of the station because he is sort of known as the mastermind behind the station itself. And Hilary Ballin, who I believe recently passed away, unfortunately, wrote a great book on Penn in the early 2000s called New York's Pennsylvania Stations. And she has a great quote: "Penn did not make you feel comfortable. It made you feel important." And that was the good and the bad side of Penn. You hear people talk about the old Penn. It's not all bright and rosy and beautiful and awe-inspiring. People said it was too big. People said it was very hard to get from track level up to the street because you had to basically climb 3 stories of very steep stairs to do it. Its scale was a little bit daunting for some people. And of course, one of the things that Grand Central Terminal has done right since 1913 was be beautiful on a scale that is very digestible to people. And of course, those William Wilgus ramps, which we still use today in Grand Central Terminal, made it very easy to get from lower levels of Grand Central out. Penn was like a climb, it was like a workout. Now, the candle in the wind, this part is actually, I'm gonna just talk briefly about the demolition process. This photo is a very ghostly Aaron Rose photo. Aaron Rose was running around with Norman McGrath, who I'll talk about in a second, who is a really dear friend and a dear contributor to a lot of the work I've done with Penn, who is an architectural photographer still alive today. Aaron Rose and McGrath were going into Penn on weekends and taking these shots when they weren't doing demolition work in the 1960s. And Aaron Rose was so disturbed by the demolition that he threw his negatives in a freezer for 30 years. And when he finally developed them in the 1990s, this is what they looked like. They had this ghostly sort of huey shadow over them because they were slightly overexposed in the freezing of them. These have been completely donated. His entire collection was donated to the Museum of the City of New York. It was very nice when I approached him about using his photos. He wrote a letter to the museum, very brief letter saying, whatever this kid wants, give it to him. It's like, thanks, Aaron. This is a Norman McGrath photo, and this is what you could see in 1963. This is what Penn Station looked like. It was neglected, it was run down, it was worn out by hundreds of thousands of people using it by the war. And of course, the fact that the Pennsylvania Railroad was hemorrhaging money after the war because train travel was declining at an incredible rate. And so they weren't making money. So by 1963, it was a signed, sealed, and delivered idea that they would use their air rights to sell the property on street level and move the station underground. This is a really great shot of what the concourse looked like right before demolition starts. And you can see it's not as beautiful as the initial photos I showed you from the early 19 teens. This is now dirty, it's worn out. Again, they blacked out those ceilings and then scraped it off. You've got a lot of people smoking, you've got car emissions, and it's brown and it's sooty and it's dirty. I don't know if any of you have seen Motherless Brooklyn. It came out last year. It was Ed Norton who actually adapted the book Motherless Brooklyn. Both very good. I've read and seen. This is actually a shot where they recreated the concourse all digitally, with the exception of the set pieces on the floor. Michelle and I actually talked to the production crew who did this work, and you can see, I'm going to go back a sec. They did a pretty good job. I love that shot with her sitting on the suitcases, just getting some sunlight. I think that was basically a real big dig into the fact that we can't do anything like that at Penn anymore. And here's a shot again of Ed Norton, the main character in the book and the movie, walking through. And I believe the production crew told this story that stuck with me. The production crew, to save money, tried to convince Ed Norton, who directed, I think he did like everything. He produced, he directed this film, to do it in Grand Central because it would save money. They could create Grand Central from the time using Grand Central Terminal. And he said, absolutely not, we're doing Penn. And this was the result. And it was really impressive, even though it was about four-ish minutes in the movie. So what happens is it is announced in 1962, 1961 that they're going to demolish the station. Not very many people speak out except this group that you see here. This is from August 1962. This is a shot of the Action Group for Better Architecture in New York, AGBANI as they were called. And they were a group of architects, professors, academics who went and said, you know, don't demolish the station, save it. And so, of course, landmarks preservation is not in effect. It will not be passed until 1965 as Penn is mid-demolition. And then 1963, October, Lipset Company, along with a couple others, come in and they just start at it. Now, Norman McGrath, whose photograph this is, he had the first thing he said to me when I met him and sat in his studio and looked at his photos were, you know, they started on the outside of the station, and of course it was all solid granite. And for a year and a half, it didn't look like it was going anywhere. Or he said it looked like it refused to yield, which I just love that. And then he said after a year and a half, they got inside and it was all faux. It was all steel and plaster. These are some of the most amazing structures in the building. Again, Norman McGrath photo. So on 31st Street and 33rd Street, you could turn your car into Penn Station. Those of you on the tour, you know this because I go on about this for a while. These were carriageways that were not outside the building. They were built into the building, and two of them. And this was a look from, I believe this is the 31st Street carriageway looking down into the building. They used to have pedestrian bridges. At this point in the photo, they have been busted up for the demolition. This is basically the skeletal shell of what's left of Penn in late 1965. Again, another Norman McGrath. And of course, one of the most heartbreaking is in the front or the fore, you see the last breath of Penn Station, which was the 7th Avenue facade, as Madison Square Garden's superstructure is forming behind it. And this is, again, probably like a mid to late 1965 photo. Reason why Norman McGrath got these really great perspectives was he was working for a structural engineer's office on the 17th floor of the Hotel Pennsylvania. And he could go up to the roof and just take what looked like shots from a helicopter, but they weren't. They were from the roof of the Hotel Pennsylvania across the street. So then, of course, where does Penn Station end up? Well, most of it ends up in the Meadowlands. And this is a cartoon from the time. It says, "Where do you want Penn?" And it's a image of a truckload of rubble coming in. And of course, the iconic photograph from 1965 of the day clock statue, or this is the day side of the clock statue, in a field in the Meadowlands as a train is going into Penn. And that's where most of the outside granite facades and statuary landed, with the exception of the Eagles. But that, again, we could do a talk on the Eagles, couldn't we? And that is, the process is wrapped up by 66, 67. They open Madison Square Garden. And of course, absolutely zero to no ribbon cutting for the new station, because everybody realizes, whoops. And so this is the Queen of No Air and Darkness, which is, we'll talk a little bit about what we have today at Penn. This is my photo leading up, which is considered to be the main entrance, 7th Avenue. So this was the idea that was floated. This was published in newspapers at the time. This is what they were going to do with your new Penn Station. They were going to put Madison Square on top of it. Pennsylvania Station, as you could see, it says all below street level. 650 trains daily. They had no idea that that was not going to be able to carry or process the amount of people who go through. At the time, it was probably about 550,000 a day. Today, Penn, pre-pandemic, sees somewhere between 675,000 to 690,000 people a day, I believe was the last count. A lot of those are MTA subway commuters as well, not to be forgotten. This is what it used to look like to walk out from the old Penn out onto 32nd Street, looking at that sky bridge connecting what is today the Manhattan Mall, which was then Gimbel's, to Saks, because they were the same company. And this is what it was now would look like to go into Penn. And this is a Norman McGrath from 1967. So stark difference. You're going down, not going out, not a lot of clearance out into the street. As people who know Penn well, you take your life into your hands. Once you get to the top of the stairs, you're just ejected into traffic and taxi lines. It reminds me of a really great quote by Vincent Scully: "We used to enter the city like gods, and now we scuttle like rats." And this is where everybody got to sit. Starkly different. When they first opened the new rendition of Penn in the late 60s, it was all covered with that brown brick, which you see. Really, I mean, we think Penn is bad today, but it was even worse back then. There was a lot more retail. This is in the Amtrak, what we would know today as the Amtrak concourse. They moved all that retail out and moved ticketing back there. But I'm going to show you another picture. This is downstairs Long Island Railroad concourse, and you can just see it was just a mishmash hodgepodge of everything they sort of left and then shoved down into the basement. And this was the entry into the new rotunda, which was supposed to mimic that Roman Baths of Caracalla main waiting room, still in much the same way today, with the exception that that is Penn Central ticketing right in front of you. Today, that's all been gone. It leads into the Amtrak waiting room. But that's where you used to go right down the escalators and buy your tickets right there. And then, of course, another shot moving further into the 70s, as you could see that really industrial brown tile, just awful stuff. But you see there's benches there, if anybody notices. Those got removed in the 80s. And then when Amtrak comes along in the early 1980s, they keep the ticketing in the rotunda. They try to spruce up the ticketing, but they realize it's not really a great place to do ticketing. They want to move it back to the other side of the concourse. I believe this photo is from 1981. And again, this is LIRR downstairs, that same awful layout and same brown. And it was funny, I was doing some research when I was doing the talk, and there was a Wired New York discussion about the old Penn. And this is the only place, that's my photo from a couple months ago, that old brick is visible. It's right when you come down the 7th Avenue escalator or stairs, and before you turn right to go down to LIRR, you can go back up to get to Madison Square and the old carport. That's the only place that old brick is left. And somebody said, yeah, that's the one, public school cafeteria feel. Can't believe the whole station was covered in this. And it's so true. It's so cafeteria public school, isn't it? And of course, the terrazzo floors don't help. And the last note about the station, the current station that is transitioning, that I like to say is, I got this note from a Kickstarter supporter, which really sort of moved me. He said, I'm 38 years old, so I never got to enjoy the old Penn Station either. I use the new one pretty frequently, and it's an insult to humanity. I hope I get to see your play. And one of the reasons why I did the play, not only because I was fascinated by it, but I was hoping that the play would bring about, and the tours now, would bring about an awareness of what we had, what we have, and what we could have. And, let's never make mistakes like this again. So January 2016, so the Eternal Space ran from November to December 2015. And then about less than a month after the show closed, I wake up one morning in January, and I get a whole bunch of texts from people saying, look at what you did. Cuomo goes on and announces that they're finishing the Farley Complex Penn Station. I had nothing to do with it, by the way, but I think everybody just thought for like a minute that wouldn't it be cool if, nothing to do. But in January 2016, Cuomo says, we are doing the Farley Complex. This isn't a myth. We're getting the funding. It's going to be done. It's going to be done by 2021. And what he initially proposes is this. This was from that very press release. He called it the Empire Gateway. And so there were jokes immediately about Empire Gateway. And you see how you got the darks and you got the reds. And of course, a lot of nerds, which I am a huge one, by the way, come up with the Return of the Jedi, the Empire, the evil Empire in a galaxy far, far away. Same color scheme, same red, same all that. They said, Cuomo's trying to do evil Empire with this new project. And I get a kick out of it, but we'll talk a little bit more specifically about it. But before that point in 2016 and 2013, when Madison Square Garden lost its operating permit in perpetuity, it was said that Madison Square Garden will lose its permit in 2023. They opened up an ideas competition, and it wasn't even a competition. It was, they asked some of the best and biggest architecture firms in the city to come up with an idea of what a new Penn could look like. And of course, we got the most fantastical stuff ever. This is from Shop. I'm going to go through these quickly because none of these were ever considered to be a reality, but they were fun, especially in 2013 to look at. Oh, wait, sorry, I'm not. I'm going to talk about Moynihan first. This whole idea came from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who in the mid to late 90s said, enough with Penn Station. We need to figure out how to make it better. And I propose we use the Farley Post Office across the street, which is a McKim Eden White building, and we actually make that Penn and make a gateway that is really suitable for New York and the people coming to New York. And of course, he got the ear of Clinton, as you see Governor Pataki there, and everybody loved the idea. It was considered almost shovel ready by 99, but then things kept happening that delayed it. Then we had recessions, then people weren't paying attention. And of course, it's not until basically 2015, 2016 that Cuomo says enough is enough, let's do it. These were old renderings. This was the original renderings back in the late 90s of what the Moynihan, he didn't know it was going to be called Moynihan yet, station would look like. This is what the model looked like. And of course, this was the very first look into what would be the new Farley Post Office station. Now, this is the ideas competition that they did in 2013. And as you can see, some of this stuff is just absolutely science fiction fantastical, but it's pretty to look at. This idea of sort of like an inverted bowl-shaped park on top where Madison Square Garden would have been. People could walk around and look into Penn. This was a crazy one, this sort of beehive structure. This was my favorite. This was a shop's idea, and I said, well, listen, if they're going to do anything, that I actually like that one because it introduces the high ceilings and the light again. And then, of course, there was what do we do with Madison Square Garden? And of course, the proposal from the very beginning was move Madison Square Garden west. Put it at that point, put it where Hudson Yards was going. This was another one. I also liked this one as well. So what happened was there were so many ideas going around, and of course, all of this thinking that the state is now behind improving Penn. The Transit Museum in Untapped New York, Untapped Cities at the time, got together and hosted a Penn Summit, or the Penn Station, a public conversation. And one of the things I always love about doing a Penn event is I always think nobody's going to show up, and they always fill to capacity, more so. And this was, Michelle and I were super worried because we teamed up with Cooper Union, and Cooper Union said, well, we're going to give you the Great Hall. And we're like, oh God, no, the Great Hall has like 998 seats. We need the smaller 200 seat one. We pretty much, Michelle, you can correct me, we pretty much filled that room to capacity, and people showed up in mass. We also teamed with the Museum of the City of New York, which was a big help as well. And we had a great panel, a great discussion of what the future of Penn could look like. And of course, the thing that kept coming up was, we talk about the building, we talk about the structure. Here's the big problem. These two tunnels, and this is a early 1900s picture of the North River tunnels, which we still use today, which are in really bad shape. This is what they look like today. And so we can talk all we want about the building, but unless we have another network of tunnels, which is of course what the Gateway Project is about, if one of those goes down, it doesn't matter how beautiful or how functional Penn is as a station, we're not going to get people into it. And so this was the idea, to build an existing tunnel that sort of loops down, a new tunnel which loops away from and sort of kidneys its way back up to a new portal right aside the existing North River portal. And of course, when this was proposed, New York was all for it, but then we had some pushback from Governor Chris Christie, who said, oh, we're not funding this. This isn't our problem. And it got stalled a bunch of times. And then there was hope that it would be renewed. And back and forth, we still do not have a tunnel. Now, what we do have is Moynihan, and Moynihan is coming soon. It's not fiction. There you see a depiction of Moynihan right next to Hudson Yards. And Moynihan, it was decided it would be named after Daniel Patrick Moynihan in honor of his work to get a better Penn for the people of New York and the visitors of New York. And of course, why did Moynihan feel so importantly about this? Moynihan was a shoeshine boy at Penn when he was younger, and he absolutely loved the building. Here is a picture from Michelle Young. This was at what was the space that will become the new concourse. It was called Skylight, which was an event space in the center sort of atrium courtyard space of the post office at the time, which is now going to be utilized as you see here in this cutaway, this main train hall, which is going to be 145,000 square feet. It is going to give you access to tracks 5 to 21. So if you come in on track 1 to 4, sorry, you're not going to get access here. You're going to have to go back to Penn. But the idea is, you see in those new beehive ceilings, it is sort of an homage to the old beehive ceilings of the concourse. Here's another rendering of it. And again, the idea is to bring a lot of light and a lot of space and a lot of easy signage, less confusion to coming into New York now. Here's a rendering. I believe this is an Amtrak. Oh, no, it's an LIR, obviously, rendering. But you can see now the ticketing offices will be larger. You'll also notice at the top of this, there's restaurants. So this is a 145,000 square foot devoted transit space, but it's 700,000 square feet retail and restaurant. So this is going to be a gigantic retail center, which of course will abut the gigantic retail center at Hudson Yards. So we're gonna have a lot of retail space. There's Amtrak's new offices and ticketing area over in Moynihan, again, a rendering. And again, restaurant, different perspective looking out onto the main area of the train hall itself. Now, Cuomo promised this would be open 2021 January. Um, he was full steam ahead. They had crews working there day and night pre-pandemic because I had been watching them. Post-pandemic, I have been told by eyewitnesses, including Michelle, that they are still working. So we'll see if that timeline is still viable. Here is a rendering of the roof itself. It's actually a very complex roof. Here are early photos of them doing construction in the atrium way. You see them, those supports that they're going to be utilizing. Those are actually original supports from the McKim and White building, which they're building the window portals into. There's somebody working on the windows. This is probably about a year and change ago. Again, this is summertime, so this is probably last July. A little earlier than that. More of an aerial view, you can see those windows becoming a reality. I love this photo. A guy under an umbrella working on the, don't want to get sunburned. And then, all right, so here's why I put this photo in. So right before the pandemic, we had the Edge at Hudson Yards open, the tallest observation deck in this hemisphere. Really cool. That is me and fellow guide Jillian Courtney. And so when I got to the top, everybody waited online for, you know, almost like 20 minutes to half an hour to get this shot at this corner. And of course, the only thing I was concerned about, if you look at right behind Jillian, there's an aerial shot of the post office. I just wanted to see how far along they were with the windows. Don't worry, I'm going to give you a close-up. There it is. So this was the first time I had ever personally seen Moynihan from that perspective. And it was the whole reason why I went up onto the Edge, because again, I'm a nerd, but there it is. The windows are done. And again, now most of the work for Moynihan has moved inside to get it complete. And that's my photo from March, I think 10th. So this is right before we go into pause. And this is a photo from Michelle Young from yesterday. Michelle was driving up near Penn, and she quick got this shot from her car. And they are still doing work on Moynihan. So here it is. It's still going. Let's see if we get that January 2021 opening date. Fun story I tell on the tour, which I'll tell you here. For those of you who haven't been on the tour, above that colonnade, which is an extremely impressive colonnade, McKim and White built because the back end of Pennsylvania Station was very plain. The 8th Avenue entrance was 4 columns. That's it, as opposed to the colonnade on 7th Avenue. And so above it, they inscribe, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor sleet, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their daily rounds." Now, we all think that is the official post office motto. It is not. Actually, it's from Herodotus, the ancient Greek writer. He's writing about the Persian courier system from the Persian-Greco Wars. That's from 800 BC. It's actually from 500 BC. The Persian-Greco Wars were 800 BC. And of course, they're Beaux Arts architects, so they put all this classical illusion on it. The USPS comes to their new post office and they see that and they go, that's really great. We should use that as our motto. So it's that gives them the idea for what I think has now been shortened to neither rain nor snow. I think that's it. That's all we get. So how do you solve a problem like Penn Station? Not Maria, but Penn Station. This was an early rendering of the 8th Avenue facade that Cuomo was pushing. Basically, he said, keep Madison Square Garden where it is, resurface it, take out the theater under Madison Square Garden and hollow it out and make a larger, more humane entrance into Penn. The idea that won everybody's sort of heart, including the New York Times and Michael Kimmelman's, was Vishant Chakrabarty's idea of kicking out Madison Square Garden, stripping it down to its steel structure, and then glassing that over. His main inspiration for this was the New York State Pavilion out in Flushing Meadow. And you can see here's a little bit from the practice of architecture and urbanism, which he is the leader, I believe he's the leader of, how that would go, sort of the layers of what put together the new, what would be Penn Madison Square Garden shell. Here's an inside rendering of what that would look like. Obviously, you can see the roof is a giant sort of map of New York. It would open up Penn completely, leaving the tracks exposed. One of the more controversial elements of this was the fact that it would be completely open. His idea was to not have sort of doors, but to actually let it sort of bleed out into the street to let traffic flow easily. Now, of course, everybody said very quickly, but what happens when it's, see, there are the open doors. What happens when it's 25 degrees and snowing? Of course, maybe there was a contingency for that. I'm not sure. This was, again, something people loved, but nothing was ever approved. So as opposed to Moynihan across the street, which is signed, sealed, delivered, and almost done, the work that's gone on in Penn is sort of piecemeal and not unified. These were ideas, none of which were approved. Here's another shot of what Vishans would look like cross-section wise. The other idea that was proposed was rebuilding Penn Station brick by brick. And that was proposed by the National Arts Society. They're a nonprofit in DC, and Rebuild Penn was the group. This is a rendering. They would say that this would actually cost less money because the renderings are already done. McKimmey and White gave us the blueprints. One of their ideas was, though, open up the walls that used to be solid and open them up to retail and restaurant space to help pay for it. And these are a couple of renderings, again, of what that might look like. You can see sort of the original, and this is almost to the detail, original Penn with then sort of new train indicator boards and all that, but keeping or restoring and adding back all of the old McKimmey and White. And they say the precedent for this was done in Europe after World War II, when a lot of the buildings in Milan and Berlin were rebuilt after the bombings. This is, instead of doing the carriageways, their idea was to actually create park spaces where the carriageways used to be. And then they said they did the comparison between Grand Central and Penn. And I actually really like this. This is a very artful footprint idea. They want to actually take the spaces on 33rd and 31st and turn them into sort of like park spaces with architecturally similar buildings. Now, what did happen, and actually this is from when I did the talk last year, Cuomo had just announced that they were going to redo the LIR concourse. The funding was made available a year ago. What they wanted to do is basically make the ceilings higher by about 10-ish feet and get a new entrance right into the LIR concourse from 7th Avenue and 33rd Street. And so all of this, again, this was not speculation, it was reality, it was done, it's being worked on. They started over the summer. As a lot of people may know, what they did is they booted out the tenants from that end of the LIR concourse, including the Duane Reeds, the Pretts, all the things that they had sort of opened a couple of years ago, Trax Bar and Grill, which was a favorite of mine, the McDonald's right in that corner, basically by like track 17, 18, 19, and 20, kicked them out and said, we are building a new concourse and a new entrance into the concourse. This is a rendering of what the new LIR ticketing area would look like. Another rendering, again, you can sort of see where you are. They're not really doing much, but sort of making the ceiling slightly higher and redoing all of the surfacing downstairs. There's that passage between the ACE and the 1, 2, 3. And this is what the entrance will look like from 33rd. This is the corner of 33rd and 7th Avenue. Looking, basically, they would be a bank of escalators and stairs that you could walk right down to that corner. Some of you may remember, or if you've been on the tour, this is where Maya Lin's eclipse sculpture used to be. It was removed and is apparently, Maya Lin is working with the MTA to figure out where it can live. A lot of people did not know we had an original Maya Lin in Penn. It was one of my favorite parts of the tour because sometimes, most of the time, a lot of people knew a lot about Old Penn, but didn't know we had an original Maya Lin, which was a functioning timepiece. Maya Lin, for those of you who may not remember or know, was the American sculptor who did the Vietnam Memorial. And so this is what it will look like to go out onto 7th Avenue from that corner. Now, Michelle and I believe last summer-ish, maybe summer, Amtrak took us on a little tour of what Amtrak was doing upstairs. And so there was that information booth, which is now gone. They were getting rid of it. They said it was a traffic blocker. Nobody was using it. It was sort of an eyesore. Their idea was get rid of it. And they would sort of open up the entrances to the Amtrak waiting room. Uh, so these entrances make them a little bit better, make them easier instead of those two double doors, get everybody in there. Now, you may remember the earlier picture I showed you. This is where Amtrak ticketing used to be in the early 1980s. They were very proud of this. And I'm not sure if this is still the distinction, but this is the only Starbucks in the world that has dual counters, which means the counter actually serves people outside of the waiting room and then inside of the gated waiting room. And that was a big deal. Amtrak really liked this. This is the only Starbucks in the world that does both sides. And of course, I love this photo. The real remnant, the old payphone bays, they were going to. All this stuff was being axed as part of an improvement plan Amtrak has planned for upstairs. The Club Acela, which if anybody uses it, is sort of a very dark and sometimes sad space. They were redoing that Club Acela, but also they're going to have a new, larger Club Acela in Moynihan as well. So just to wrap up, the real thing that I love about Penn, and yes, I say love and Penn in the same sentence, are what's still there from 1913. And this is the last gate indicator for the arrival staircase, a big hit on the tour, because what they would do is they'd hang exit signs off of this gate on each side of it. At the top of the gate, you'll see there's a little spigot or spout that had a globe for a light on it, because Penn at night was very dark, because Penn was designed for natural light, the last of its kind. And of course, my favorite, the little painting the last hand-painted sign from the old Pennsylvania Railroad days. This is right by the 123, the back of where Track's back entrance used to be. Of course, there's a light over it, unfortunately, but you can see it says PENNRR trains, and the arrow is pointing them down the Hilton passageway back towards the lower Amtrak concourse, which would have been Pennsylvania Railroad. And the gate, for those of you who are LIRR commuters, that's the LIRR waiting room. You may know it well. That gate is an original stanchion from the original LIRR waiting room, which was actually at that spot. LIRR still maintains its original footprint for the most part since 1910. Just this January, they moved the ticketing from where it was since 1910. That counter has been in the same place, and they closed it up and moved it down the hall for the renovations. And then, of course, the glass block. So I had talked to you about the glass block. This is at the start of the Hilton passageway. One of my favorite parts of the tour is I go all throughout talking to people about McKim, and White's genius dual concourse system, where departing passengers leaving New York left from the upper level, which is today Amtrak, and they would arrive into the lower level, which is today what we know as LIRR downstairs. And how did they get the light down there? As I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, that glass block floor would shine light down from the ceiling through to the lower levels. And the terrazzo that you're looking at on the floor in front of the Hamilton advertisement, that's how old this picture is, that is glass block floor also, which brought light down to track level. Absolutely amazing stuff. And you can, if you go down to the bottom of track 13 stairs and look up from track level to the ceiling, you'll see a nice network of glass block floor. And there's a very artful photograph of the glass block floor. Everybody goes, oh, I thought it would be a lot bigger. It seems bigger in the pictures. This is a really great, I actually tasked Aaron to do this for me when I did this talk for the National Art Club. I said, Aaron, can you superimpose what's there in Penn today with what used to be there in Old Penn? And so this is a passageway a lot of people think was a new addition to Penn. This is sort of the back westmost passage. It's under the current Amtrak concourse. And so you see the two aluminum round coverings in the modern photo. Those correspond with the two supports in the older photo. Those are the same supports. They're just covered up with new aluminum. So what's above our heads under that drop ceiling? That glass block floor. And if you remove the drop ceiling, obviously it's still there. It's just been covered up with terrazzo up on the top level. This is another great shot. So this is, this is right by, you see it says 11 and 12 where the soldiers are sitting, and this is 11 and 12 in Penn today. And again, it's the same footprint, same uh, area, same staircases, which were turned into escalators. And again, under that terrazzo is the glass block floor that those troops are sitting on. And again, we asked a very nice, I think it was a PR, not Jason, who's really great to work with over at Amtrak, but a woman that came up from Philadelphia, and we said, glass block floor. And she goes, yeah, I know people, I don't know why people care about it. And of course, like it was like a stake in my heart. It's like, why do people care about it? Because it's history. So, and this was one of the most greatest, this is again, Michelle and I had kept saying, God, just when we think Penn has just sort of run out, then something new happens. And I believe it was December, we got a tip off from an Untapped big fan and former Untapped contributor, Alex Wallach, who said, hey, I noticed these. And so we ran down there, Michelle ran down there, I ran down there, and we realized that this was an IRT connecting passageway from what was the Long Island concourse downstairs to what was the Interborough Rapid Transit, the one train platforms, which were walled up and covered up in the 80s. And so what the biggest discovery behind this was, which I just lost my stuff, was that those are Guastavino vaulted arch ceilings in there. And they're like Penn's little mini whisper galleries. And when we reached out to Amtrak and said, what's going on? Jason said that they're looking into the viability of using these passages again to get people from the trains to Amtrak. Now, if you look through that door that's open, you'll see cement block wall, which was added in the late 1980s. On the other side of that wall, you see there's a wooden grate resting on the wall down the stairs. So look through the door, I see a lot of people moving in. That is the back end of the passageway to the LIRR, that long barrel vaulted passageway that had the big clock sculpture on it. So what they did when they redid the LIRR concourse in the late 80s and early 90s was they walled up what used to be the connecting passage to the one platform. They walled it up, created sort of that little room, and then blocked off this Guastavino tiled passage. There's another good shot of the Guastavino ceilings. And again, this was the real find for us, was who built these? Was it McKim, Mead and White, or was it the IRT? Because both companies used Guastavino. And so when we found out this was under the purview of Amtrak, we knew it was McKim, Mead and White because Amtrak owns the facility. It's not state, it's Amtrak. And state would have meant it was the Interborough Rapid Transit. And I'm closing with this photo, which was again taken by, I know for those of you who've been joining us a lot, Aaron Assis has been our go-to guy of taking pandemic New York photos. And he goes out and then he sends them to me. And this one, I saw it and I almost cried. I have never seen Penn like that, with literally 1 to 2 human beings all the way in the far corner. That's not even Penn on Christmas Day. I mean, that is Penn in a pandemic. There's no one there. And that was taken early March, early pandemic, probably the second or third week of March. And that is what Penn looks like today. What you see in the fore of that photo is exposed ceiling from the barrel vaulted hallway, which you can see the nuts and bolts and sort of superstructure of 1910 Penn Station. And I point that out on the tour. One of the gifts of the construction of that new end of the concourse is that you can see the old Penn superstructure that has hemmed in what we know as Penn Station today. And so the end of the Once and Future King ends with this Latin quote, which in Latin just says, here ends the once and future king, the beginning. And of course, the idea is that Arthur, in Arthurian legend, Arthur will come back again to unify and be the great king that Britain needs. And of course, in our heart of hearts, we hope that Penn will come again on some kind of scale. We know probably not the one that we used to have, but we hope it is the beginning. And so I thank you for joining me. for this, again, not tour, but talk that I gave to the National Art Club. The Remnants of Penn Station tour is definitely a lot of information and pictures about old and demolition Penn. And I thank you for joining me. I entertain or would love to entertain any questions you have.
Hey, Justin. So I will quickly ask some of the questions that have been coming through. But for everyone, if you do want to ask the question verbally, you can raise your hand. There's a raise hand function. And then I will unmute you, and then you can ask your question. But let me go through some of the ones that have come through. Someone asked, what is the status of the Madison Square Garden lease? So I believe you said it ended in 2023. Can it be renewed?
So it is their operating permit. It's not their lease. So the idea is that they would have an operating permit in 2023. It can be renewed. Madison Square Garden Corporation said, we will happily move from where we are, but you're going to have to pay $2 billion. We're selling you our air rights back. So the idea would be if Madison Square Garden is forced to move, they're going to sell the facility and move it. There have now been new proposals or new thoughts that, well, we can't move Madison Square Garden west because of Hudson Yards anymore. Let's move it east because those buildings are, who cares? But actually those buildings are historic. A lot of them are McKimmey and Whites too, to the east. So the idea is they can, I believe, re-opt for the permit. And they're basically saying, buy us out if you want us to move.
Okay, great. Is the new Penn Station going to be known as Moynihan Station? What is the difference again? Was another question.
Good. That's a very good question. So Moynihan Station is going to be known as Moynihan Station. It's actually officially, the post office is now called Moynihan Station. It's no longer Fargo. Penn Station will continue to be Penn Station across the street. What Cuomo wants is that once they complete the renovations over at Penn that he's proposed for LIRR, that whole complex, including a new complex I did not talk about, which was announced right before the pandemic, that Cuomo is going to throw eminent domain on 31st Street and create something called Penn Station South, which is going to be 8 new tracks to the south of the current tracks. That whole complex will be known as the Empire Gateway.
Got it. Someone asked what happened to the 2 original Eagles that has been on the 7th Avenue side, and I can answer some of that. So that's, of course, one of our favorites. And Justin and I actually regularly take road trips to locate the Eagles that have scattered around the country. And our latest was scheduled for June to go up to the one in Vinalhaven, Maine. Vinalhaven is actually where they got the marble and granite for the original Penn Station. And there's one Eagle that's still there. But the ones on the 7th Avenue side mysteriously disappeared one day. And I was having trouble getting Vornado to give me an answer. MTA told me that they belonged to Vornado. Vornado wouldn't answer, so I published a story saying that they were no longer there, and that's, of course, when Vornado finally gave an answer. And so they said that they have moved them into storage for restoration, and that they will be back, but of course MTA is also saying we don't know where they're going to put it. So yeah, TBD on that. Let's see. Someone asks, will the Moynihan main entrance be on 33rd Street where the event space entrance was? Will any changes be made to the 8th Ave post office space?
Yeah, so good question. The post office hallway upstairs is landmarked. It's an interior landmark, so it'll be exactly like it is. It will still function as a post office. The entrances are going to be basically, I think a lot of people are going to use 8th Avenue on both 33rd and 31st. That's what they're predicting, but the entrances are actually going to really consider to be on 33rd, Mid Street, and 31st. There's a glass atrium way they're building, and they're hoping that people will actually enter the facility that way because it's dead center of the facility. I'm thinking people are just going to use 8th Avenue.
Another question. Nice. Sorry. Is the mural high on the wall in the original Penn Station waiting room a map of the Atlantic Ocean?
There are 2. That's a really, wow, that person is really good. There are 2. There was one of Long Island, actually just Long Island, and then one of the Atlantic. Mainly, I think it was the whole globe unfurled. But there is, if you look closely on the opposite window, just Long Island because of LIRR.
Another question, have there ever been any surveys done about the impact of Penn versus Grand Central in terms of people moving to the burbs?
That is a very interesting question, and I do not know, but that would be a fascinating study. Very fascinating.
Will Moynihan be only for Amtrak? Another question.
Moynihan will be for anybody who can use it for tracks 5 to 21. So a lot of people think, well, it was made just for Amtrak or it's just for LIRR. Listen, if you're a New Jersey Transit rider and you know your train's coming in on track 17, you can use Moynihan. The problem is most of New Jersey is somewhere between 1 to 9, and you don't know until it's too late, which is one of the problems. So if you're sitting in Moynihan and you go, oh crap, my train's at gate 3, you're going to have to run across to figure out how to get there. So Jersey Transit is saying we basically have to use Penn. LIRR mainly, although I'm not an LIRR rider, I have heard from other LIRR riders that Moynihan will be great for them. But it's for everybody who can use them.
Got it. And then, what police department had jurisdiction of the old Penn Station? Was it NYPD or MTA or Amtrak Police? Did the old Penn Station have any crime problems, or was it known for crime?
Old Penn Station would have been NYPD because it was Pennsylvania Railroad, and Pennsylvania Railroad was a private company. I believe Pennsylvania Railroad had security, but I have to double check on that. That's something that's fleeting around in my mind from research. When it became Amtrak, then of course Amtrak was federal and they had their own policing. And then of course MTA also in 68 had their own policing. That's why you see Amtrak police, MTA police today, NYPD, there's state troopers there, there's National Guard, both in Grand Central and in Penn for terrorism purposes. But back then it would have been strictly NYPD. Was it known for crime? Yeah, it was actually. So in the late 50s and 60s, a lot of people, eyewitnesses who are still alive today say, Penn, you walked in, it was gorgeous, felt like you were in church, but at ground level, it was dark, it was dirty. There were lots of little corners for people to hide in. And there was a lot of so-called vagrancy that went on in Penn, especially at night, because as I had said, it was very dark in Penn at night because they had basically, as you see in that picture that's up right now, they had those freestanding globe lights everywhere at night, but during the day you had all this great luscious daylight, but at night it was dark and it was great for people to hide in. Now, was it like all the time running the gauntlet? I don't think so, but there definitely was high instances of crime in Old Penn later on in its life.
I'm going to quickly unmute Atticus, who has raised his hand to ask a question, and then I'll go through the rest of the questions that have come through the chat.
Yep.
Why is the MD going to building the Long Island Railroad concourse if the Long Island Railroad's trains are going to be diverted to Moynihan Station?
Say that again. What building? You came in and out there.
Oh, he's typing. Okay. Thanks, Atticus.
Thanks, Atticus. Sorry, I couldn't get the beginning. It was fuzzy.
Why is the MTA going to be rebuilding the Long Island Railroad concourse if the Long Island Railroad's trains are going to be diverted to Moynihan Station?
Atticus, that's a very good question. So one of the things is because I believe 40% of the commuter numbers that come into Penn are Long Island Railroad commuters. That's a very high number. So 40% of over 600,000 people a day. I'm bad at math, but those are high numbers. They want to keep options for LIRR both in Moynihan and also in Penn under Madison Square Garden so that there's multiple places for people to get onto the trains. It's the same tracks running under both complexes, but this will give them more opportunities to board the train. Good, very good question, Atticus.
Rich Praveet says, thanks, hoping that we eventually build Penn Station granite block by granite block. They've done this elsewhere in the world. Dresden, Christ the Savior, why not here?
Sure. Hey, again, the idea is who pulls the trigger on that, right? So is it Vornado because they run the retail holdings? Is it Amtrak because technically the federal government owns the space? The idea is, who do you convince that whatever new Penn rendering is the best to pull the trigger on it? And of course, Cuomo was a big part of it as well.
And then there was one last one that I've seen. Is there any thought to restore underground connections from this whole complex to the subway path complex at 6th Avenue? There is still one closed tunnel part of the way, right?
No, at the moment, anything to connect 6th Avenue, Herald Square back to Penn has been continually denied. Basically because the passage, which was known as the main passage, which was known as the Gimbels Passageway, was again very dangerous. It was very small, it was very tight, very low ceilings, and it was really hard to patrol. So when Gimbels went belly up, they sealed it up on both sides. And as far as I know, there is nothing on tap at the moment to open it back up again. It would be a great gift because I'm a BDF guy. I'm F-Train user, going to Penn all the time. I'd love it if I could get from the F-Train Herald Square over to Penn, but not anytime soon, as far as I know.
Okay, great. Do we have any last questions?
These are great questions, guys.
For everyone still left, this has been probably our most attended event so far. We had over 106 registrants, so it tells you again the continuing interest in Penn Station, its past and future, and we hope you guys will join us on our real tour of the remnants of Penn Station. We showed you just a few, but again, there are dozens and we keep finding more.
Yeah, we didn't scratch the surface today.
And a lot of the people that work for Amtrak, Long Island Railroad, MTA, have promised to show us some other things that are really behind the doors. So, Justin, was your play recorded where I can watch it somewhere? Yes.
Actually, I was just going to say that. So Michelle and I have been talking about doing an event with the insiders. I have a full-length recording, which was pretty good. You know, it's always kind of rough when you record live theater, but the quality is pretty good. And we are thinking that we may do an event in the coming weeks where insiders can watch the play, and then we can do like a roundtable and discuss it and talk a little bit more about Penn. So stay tuned. If anybody has any direct questions about the play or anything about Penn, feel free to email me, justin@untappedcities.com. I always love to keep the conversation going. But yeah, hopefully we'll be able to get the play out there for you guys to see it in this time when a lot of people have time to watch stuff. So
a couple more questions came in, Justin. So
hey, listen, I'm here. I'll take them.
Any other good movie recommendations that portray old Penn Station?
Good question. So there is a movie called The Clock with Judy Garland, which takes place a big portion of it takes place in Penn, but it was mainly created on a soundstage, much like Motherless Brooklyn, but they did a very good job with it. It's not a great movie, but The 7-Year Itch, I always tell people, watch The 7-Year Itch. The first 4 minutes of The 7-Year Itch with Marilyn Monroe is actually filmed in Penn on the concourse in color. You really get a good feel for it. There's a great PBS documentary, which I actually did some very mild consulting on, the rise and fall of Penn Station it was an American Experience on PBS, which I know is on their app. Really great footage of Penn in real time. There's also, I continually forget the name of it. And whoever you are who had the question, if you want to email me, I will find the name of it. There's a really great noir movie, sort of murder mystery movie. And there's some really dark scenes filmed on the concourse. The pigeons are flying around. It's really, you can see just what a mess Penn was in the early 60s at the time. I can't remember the name of it.
Okay. James asks and comments, I've already been caught waiting in the New Monahan waiting for New Jersey Transit, only to find my train was announced to leave from track 2. What a rush. Any plans to create a better underground pedestrian cut through?
Well, so one of the things that Cuomo is alluding to is that when Penn Station South is built on 31st Street and using that whole area, that there's going to be a better connecting way for Jersey and the new capacity that they are creating for Moynihan. So maybe, I'm not sure. That was just thrown out. There's very little out right now about Penn Station South. It was announced literally weeks before the pandemic, and then obviously Cuomo has turned his attention towards the pandemic, rightfully so. So we'll keep posted.
Steve asks, is the Glossopino area open to the public at this time? A lot of people have asked that.
It is unfortunate. No, it is only, you can only view it from the platform. So all of those pictures are via window. We've tried. I actually had 2 news outlets who followed me around Penn, reputable news outlets. So Good Day New York's morning show and WPIX's morning show both did specials, contacted Amtrak, said, we're experienced crews. And Amtrak said, nope, absolutely not. Sorry, can't let you in right now. So see what happens.
The other thing that we found to be really interesting covering Penn and exploring it for so many years is that these agencies are often really surprised that there's interest in this. So you ask them and they're like, but why would you want to go in there? There's this track indicator that's buried in like the baggage area of Amtrak. And every time we're like, can we go see it? And they're like, why? So I think over time we've been able to see more and work with these agencies to see more, but it just takes a little bit of time. Richard Praveet says, Strangers on a Train. Is that the name of the movie?
Yes.
Okay.
Good job.
Great. I think I've captured everyone. If anyone did not get their answer read out by me, type it in. But hopefully we'll see you guys very soon. We have a tour of Riverside Park on Tuesday, Riverside Park and Riverside Drive, actually. Justin will be giving a talk on his other OCD obsession, the World's Fairs, next week. And we'll also have a talk on the secrets of the Brooklyn Bridge.
Ooh, I just got excited. I saw that. I hope you're
and then next week, we'll also have a talk, which is not listed yet, but on Stuytown and its history. And that is actually truly very fascinating.
It is. And I see John is on, the gentleman who will be leading it is on this talk. And he is a resident, longtime resident. And he has what's super cool, the actual brochure, real estate brochure from the 1970s that he's taken apart and will walk us through. It's really fascinating stuff.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us again, everyone. So great to see everyone. Is the World's Fair Tour online? We're going to have the talk next week, and it'll be recorded. And if anyone wants to see old talks that you might have missed, if you go to untappedcities.com/virtual content, one word, virtual content, and you log in, you will see all the videos. And we get each video up a few days after each talk. So if you missed anything, they're there. And this one will be online as well coming up. And World's Fair Tour, we will have that back when we can all see each other in person again.
Also, one of the things that we have in the hopper for World's, if you're World's Fair enthusiasts, are the New York State Pavilion. We are putting together what we hope will be an actual virtual visit with the paint crew of the pavilion, get you actually out via stream to the pavilion in Flushing Meadow. Aaron Assis, again, the photographer I talked to you guys about, he is on the People for Pavilion committee, and he is, and now I have become very good friends with the Pavilion paint crew. So we're hoping to do a special talk about the New York State Pavilion out there, which is a really fascinating topic too. TBD. Keep posted.
Do you guys have a Venmo account? Justin, what's your Venmo account?
I believe it's Justin-Rivers.
All right.
It might be Justin-Rivers too, actually. I'm not sure.
Well,
I think it's Justin-Rivers too. If there's a Justin-Rivers too, it's me.
I send mine, which we will then donate to the Untapped Fund.
However that works. And thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your support. See you Tuesday.
Bye, guys. Thanks so much for
Bye.
joining us.